That's just what I was going to use as an analogy. If you want to know what irreducible complexity is, it's any system that depends upon several working parts. If you take one part away, the whole system collapses. And the analogy that Malcolm just used was a mousetrap or a rat trap or something of that. Where if you think of a mousetrap, a typical old-style mousetrap, not one of these that's kind to the mice, but one of these that... They're all horrible. But if you think of a mousetrap, if you take away any part, if you take away the latch, you can't catch mice. If you take away the thing that traps them, you can't catch mice. If you take away the spring, you don't get any mice. Every single bit has to be there in order to catch mice. And that's a simple analogy of a irreducibly complex system. Take one bit away, the whole system falls down. And the thing is, everything that God created, I think without exception, and I say I think because I could be wrong, but as I've considered it, I struggle to find anything that God has created that isn't irreducibly complex. In other words, life forms where if you take away one aspect, they'll just die. Or in fact, never could have lived. That's the other important thing. Now, this is not going to contain a huge amount of scripture, this study. It's going to contain examples of things that are irreducibly complex. And some of the notes are a bit technical, but I'll tell you stuff that bypasses the technical. Well, the technical stuff's in the notes for those that want it. But let's just quickly go through these scriptures, because these are all scriptures that talk about, surprisingly enough, I couldn't find the term irreducible complexity in the scriptures. But if you turn to Nehemiah 9 and verse 6, the scripture says, what I like about Nehemiah 9 is it molds other things into his creation. So it says, verse 6 says, you alone are the Lord, you have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. You give life to all of them, and the heavenly host bows down before you. And it's not relevant to tonight, but it goes on to say, you are the Lord God who chose Abraham and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldees, and it goes on in like vein. So in the book of Nehemiah, the creation and the subsequent formation of the Jewish nation and the progress of the nations is all part of God's creative work. The Bible doesn't separate them out. It presents us with both to marvel at. But clearly, if you take this verse and if you believe it the way it is written, you have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them, and you've given life to all of them. There's no room in there for anything to have evolved. It's all been a creative act. And this idea of, oh yeah, but God started the process of evolution and is a nonsense. But more on that later. If you flip to Isaiah 45, and I've only picked, I think when I looked at a list of verses I could have picked to do with creation, there was a list, an incomplete list of 65 scriptures. So, there's plenty of it. Isaiah 45 and verse 18 says, for thus says the Lord who created the heavens, he is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. So we glean from that, if the Bible is to be believed, which it is, then the Lord didn't only create it all, but he deliberately created it to be lived in. Psalm 139 verse 13, you don't really need to turn there because the scripture's on the screen, but you can if you want to. For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. That in itself is, because the world thinks of the idea of sperm meets egg and baby develops. But the scripture adds to that the fact that the Lord forms you forms your inward parts and weaves you in your mother's womb. So there's an element of the action of God in every child born. Again, you don't need to turn to Job 40, verse 15, unless you really want to, because there's only one line that I picked out, which is, "Behold now Behemoth, which I made as well as you. He eats grass like an ox." So a direct claim of God when he spoke to Job, and that chapter 40 is that lovely chapter where Job and God are having a conversation, but it's a bit one-sided. And he says, "Behold" simply means look, Behemoth. Behemoth normally means monster. It's probably a dinosaur, but we don't know for sure. Lots of, shall I say, helpful versions suggest it might be a hippo or a crocodile. I've never seen a hippo with a tail like a young cedar, and I've never seen a crocodile with legs like tubes of bronze. So it's a nonsense. But this is an attempt by Bible translators to keep things so that non-Christians will believe them, I think. Because why would you mess with that scripture? It's monster. It's either a big dinosaur or a big dragon. Because
they can't accept
that
dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, something I find fascinating, I've forgotten her name, there's a lady who discovered soft tissue in dinosaur bones.
Yes.
Right? Soft tissue that has not been degraded beyond recognizability. And so you would think, because they'd always said tissue cannot survive for millions of years. So when they found tissue in dinosaur bones, you would think they would say, "Oh, we must be wrong about the millions of years." No, what they said was, "Oh, tissue can survive millions of years because we found it in dinosaur bones." It's mad, isn't it? So as I've written there, every living thing God made is irreducibly complex. And if you take one of the features away, it cannot live or could not have lived in the first place. Now, Darwin actually said, and that's a quote directly from Darwin. It wasn't Darwin that wrote it down, but he was interviewed and he made this quote, and I can't remember who recorded it. "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Well, what we're going to find, just with the few examples we're going to look at this evening, is that his theory has absolutely broken down. Because there are many, many things that could not possibly happen by a series of small adjustments.
Well, he himself couldn't have done.
No, and you wonder why he couldn't see that. Well, he couldn't see that because he didn't want to see that. I think some historians who speak about Darwin's early years say he was mad at God anyway. Yeah.
And he had other people surrounding him who were older than him, actually were pushing this whole basis of evolution. They were making him their mouthpiece, basically. There were other people actually encouraging him in this particular quest of his.
So evolutionary scientists themselves now don't believe Darwin's theory anymore. But instead of going, Darwin's been wrong, therefore God must be right, they're still trying to find evolutionary answers to their questions, and they fail miserably all along the way. The problem is that it's been so sewn into the educational establishments that you can't even have a decent debate on the topic anymore. Because as soon as you they just go, "Oh, well, we know that's rubbish because evolution's been proven and we're not listening to this rubbish." And you say, well, okay, give me some evidence for your beliefs. And they never can. They can never bring evidence. They could bring a lot of supposition, a lot of just so stories, a lot of straw men, but they can't bring evidence the way a capable Christian debater can do. They still get rubbished, and they get rubbished for no reason to do with the evidence presented.
Just to say just one more thing on Darwin, if I may. One of his big benefactors, of course, was his father-in-law, who was the son of the founder of Wedgwood Pottery.
All right.
And it was the whole family, a very wealthy family, who were the son of the original Josiah Wedgwood. I was just checking my facts, thinking I do know this, but I thought I'd better check it. It's Wedgwood, the son of the original Mr. Wedgwood, was in fact Darwin's father-in-law.
Right.
So there we go.
So it's partly at least his fault.
It is.
So what I've tried to do here is I've tried to start small. So this is just a cell in the human body or an animal body. And there's a page of notes after this, which gets a bit technical in places, but we don't need to understand the technical parts of it. So the nucleus, that purple bit in the middle, nucleus and the nucleolus, that contains your DNA. Now, it's probably important to think about size here. In terms of complete structures, an atom is the smallest, and there are probably as many atoms in a cell as there are cells in the human body. So that gives you an idea of scale. But that is just a cell, and the nucleus contains the DNA. Around the outside, you've got the what they call the endoplasmic reticulum. You don't need to remember the names. There's a smooth and a rough version, but effectively, that stores the information that the nucleus makes when it's recreating DNA or RNA. Those brown sausage-like structures, the mitochondrion, they are the powerhouse of the cell. So they are the equivalent of the muscles of the body. They give energy to the cell and they provide it. That's where respiration in the cell takes place. So it deals with oxygen, breaks down sugars, deals with oxygen, releases energy to the cell for the cell to function. They have within the cell, and it's not labeled specifically on there, but they have things called organelles. And an organelle, as it sounds like, is a mini organ, right? It's an organ, only tiny. And that Golgi apparatus, or sometimes it's pronounced Golgi, that is effectively a transport system. So within the cell, which you can't see unless you look through a microscope, there is a transport system that transports stuff that the cell needs inwards and transports refuse and stuff the cell doesn't need so it excretes it outwards. Now this is, every single cell of your body is like this. And what's more, they're self-replicating. So, as I think I've said this before, all of us sitting here, there isn't a single cell sitting before me now that was there when you were born. They've all changed. You've had a complete change several times during your lifetime. So they make copies. The cells make copies of each other, and as one cell dies, another one is produced that's an exact replica of the old one. And part of the aging process and part of the process of disease is when the cells don't replicate properly. So you finish up with tumours or whatever, growths of various sorts. Vesicles, I must admit, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at what these things were for because I'd have been there for weeks. Ribosomes, which are on the right, about halfway down, the ribosomes copy information for all the proteins produced in the cell using blueprints provided by the nucleus. So what you learn from this is the cell itself is irreducibly complex. Unless the nucleus produces a blueprint, the ribosomes have got nothing to work on. And if the ribosomes have got nothing to work on, then your DNA doesn't get reproduced in order to keep you going. You'd have a very short life. You probably couldn't have lived in the first place. I've talked about the mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, a network of membranes inside a cell. Its main functions are to transport new materials. So you've got a transport system within a transport system. That next paragraph is a bit technical, but they effectively, stuff is sent out to the endoplasmic reticulum, and they send stuff to the outer cell membrane, and they either become part of the membrane, or they pass out of the membrane and out of the cell as stuff that is surplus to requirements. And I don't need to go on and on just to make the point that the human cell, you couldn't have a human body or you couldn't have an animal body if you didn't have a fully functioning cell. Every single part has to do its thing. Now, if you look at the cells of bacteria, they are simpler, but they're still very complex. They're not as complex as the animal cell, but they're still far too complex to just be able to burst into life from nothingness. Even the cytoplasm is a jelly-like substance, so all that sort of ocean blue area is cytoplasm. It's just jelly. It's mostly water with other stuff, and it's a gelatinous substance. And even that is finely balanced in its pH. Otherwise, the cell would either explode or shrivel, depending on whether it was too salty or not salty enough.
And it's your CO2 that you have in your body that helps regulate your pH balance.
Yes, that's true.
And just one thing on cells before you move on. There is one part of the body, which is the eye. The inner cells, if they get damaged, do not replicate and repair themselves. So if something gets damaged on one of the cells, what the other cells do is they grow to take up the space of the cell that has died. So there are still cells.
Yeah.
So the other cells around it, the damaged ones, what they do, they just grow bigger to take up the space of the dead one.
So that's even more irreducibly complex. It's remarkable. The cell membrane seals everything inside the cell. Now, one of the reasons that I think messing with the COVID vaccine is so dangerous is the cell membrane seals everything inside the cell, and it doesn't let foreign stuff in. And that's how you can be sure that your immune system and other things remain untainted and untarnished, because although things get into the body, they don't penetrate into the nucleus of the cells. But these vaccines have been specifically designed to put new DNA into the nucleus of the cells. So you finish up, you're overriding God's main defense against illness. I don't think we've even seen the beginning of the illnesses that are going to come from those vaccines, unfortunately. But that's my view, and I hope I'm proved to be wrong. And there are other cells that have different organelles. So you get some cells have what's called flagellum, or flagella is the plural, which is like it's like a swimmy thing. It's a lashing tail that propels it. So sperm cells, for example, have a flagellum.
Have you seen, just about flagella, some of them, they're not actually mechanical, we create mechanical things, but they're as good as they literally rotate on spindles, of cell, flesh, whatever you call it. It's an engine, but it's not an engine. It's ridiculous. It's moving parts.
It's a microscopic engine, is what it is.
And that just blows my mind.
Now, when Darwin first came up with his theory, of course, they hadn't got into microscopy very much, and they didn't know the complexities. However, I think microscopy started about 50 years after Darwin started putting forward his views, something like that. And so very quickly after Darwin started, they did know about this stuff, but they didn't change their tune. I think there's a book written by some American fella called 7 Men Who Rule the Earth from the Grave. And in that book, Darwin is listed as someone whose ideas rule the earth from the grave, even though most of them have been proved to have been rubbish by now. I entered into a conversation online recently where somebody said he was the greatest asset to mankind, or something like that. If you think of plant cells, the other organelle that some cells have, if they're plant cells, is called a chloroplast, which is what enables plants to process carbon dioxide and release oxygen to the atmosphere. All of these arguments about we're getting too much CO2 are absolute rubbish. We would have far superior crops if we had more CO2. And they would be oxygenating the air for us to breathe. So science has lost its way, unfortunately. the Golgi apparatus looks like this, and this is inside the cell, and it's a transport system, transports stuff out and absorbs stuff in, and so all these little nobbles or nodules around the outside are rich in blood-like substances. They're not red, but the membrane around it is what's called a semi-permeable membrane, which means that solutions can pass into and out of it, depending on whether they're concentrated or not. And normally, if it's a concentrated substance on the outside, it will absorb it. If it's a concentrated substance on the inside, it will expel it. But you have a transport system in every cell of your body, and yet we're supposed to believe that just because some explosion millions and billions of years ago, it all just happened. The first single-celled animals are said to have been the amoeba. If you look at an amoeba under a microscope, it's a very complex animal, even though it's tiny, tiny. So there's immense complexity at the microscopic level, and the cell that we've just looked at needs every part to function. Without any one of those parts, the cell would die. So the whole body that was dependent on the cell would also die. And when cells go crazy, bodies die. That's how cancers form. So it had to be designed. Not only did it have to be designed, but it had to be designed with forethought. It had to be part of a plan, because every cell serves a function, and whoever designed it had to know the function before he designed the cell. So that kind of speaks for itself, but it's worth mentioning because people think, oh, it can all just happen because of a big bang. It can't. Somebody has to sit down and think, what do I want this cell to do? And therefore, what do I need to design into it? And by the way, we can't replicate that design. We are not bright enough. We're supposed to accept that a massive chemical accident produced something that we cannot reproduce and have not been able to reproduce over the whole of man's existence. So we've seen this at cellular level, and we can also look at irreducible complexity at the level of individual organs. You can pick any organ of your body. I've chosen for tonight the human ear. But you could just as easily pick the respiratory system, your lungs, if you like. Irreducibly complex. I won't go into it, but they are. If you don't have the bronchi and the bronchus, and if you don't have the little alveoli sacs in the lungs, and one of the major industrial diseases, things like asbestosis or even pneumoconiosis, COPD even, comes about because we breathe dust into the lungs, and the little air sac deep in the lungs where your oxygen goes from the air into your bloodstream and the carbon dioxide comes out and you breathe it out, where all that happens, a tiny little microscopic sacs deep in the lungs, we fill them full of dust. And they don't work. And they get scarred, and then they get tumours. And so you
Having seen lungs at a post-mortem of a smoker, absolutely black, but the pathologist at that time who was teaching us all those years ago said if this guy had started to give up from day one of his giving up, his lungs would start to heal.
Yes, yeah. But you could pick the human eye. The human eye is amazingly complex and an astonishing piece of design. And you take away any part of it. I mean, just to think of one part of it, your eye over your eyeball is like a continuation of your skin. But obviously, if it was just your skin, you wouldn't be able to see through it. So it's a window in your skin. Now, if that window was in the wrong place, you wouldn't be able to see. But it's as simple as that. You just look at that and you think, that can't happen by accident, that there's a window in the skin in just the right place for the eye to see through it. It's a complex organ, and if you take away any part of it, you can't see. If you can't see, you'll struggle to survive. People do find that their senses compensate for the one that's missing. But if you think of primitive life and fighting for survival, You're a massive disadvantage in that environment. I mean, in our environment, we look after our blind people, not as well as we should sometimes, but we do look after them. In a primitive environment, they would never, if you think of the evolutionary point of view, how did they survive while they were evolving eyesight? So you could look at the reproductive system, you could look at the digestive system. The digestive system is hugely complex, with different enzymes coming in at different places in your gut for you to absorb different proteins and sugars and starches and whatever. And your body keeps what it needs. This in itself is complex, keeps what it needs and excretes the rest. That's a balanced system. Or it would be if I had stopped stuffing my face. If you think of the evolutionary view, where we were apes and we grew into something else, but the ape could never have developed because the ape is irreducibly complex. We were on a cruise ship, Sharon and I, and there was a lady there giving us the sort of life history of the whale. And apparently it formed from this animal called a pachycetus, and the pachycetus is a bit like a cow. And so it evolved out of the sea and then decided to go back into the sea. So it evolved this new set of organs to allow it to remain a mammal and to re-enter the sea. To just even imagine that happening it's just like a kid's fairy tale. It has no basis in fact whatsoever. And the number of genetic changes that would have to take place in order to, go from normal lungs breathing through your nasopharyngeal tract and all that, to go from that to breathing through a hole in the top of your head and being able to swim 5,000 meters deep. And why do they even bother? But what's more, we gobble it up. Oh, you're a scientist, you must know best. So the human ear, this is just one organ in our body. And just to start with, it is irreducibly complex. So what you have on the outside of your head, you've got, it's not labelled, but the pinna, which is the flappy thing that sits on the side of your head. The auricle, which funnels sound down a tunnel to your tympanic membrane, which is your eardrum. So as I'm speaking to you now, I am creating pressure waves with my voice. And that pressure wave is going down your ear and making your eardrum vibrate. When your eardrum vibrates, it jostles three little tiny bones. They're the smallest bones in the human body. They're usually called the hammer, the anvil, and stirrup. Their proper name is the malleus, incus, and stapes. So you've got pneumatics giving you air pressure into the ear, and then at the eardrum, it turns into mechanics because the eardrum vibrates and those little bones jostle. And then you notice it says stapes attached to oval window. That snail shell, which is called the cochlea, and cochlea means snail shell, has a little an oval window in it, and the stapes is sealed over the top of the oval window. And just below it is a round window, and these windows are flexible. So every time the stirrup bone or the stapes pushes in, the oval window pops out. So they compensate for one another. And inside that cochlea is a load of fluid. So what you've got is you've got pneumatics, you've got mechanics, and now you've got hydraulics, all within about that much inside your head, working your hearing. And the crazy thing is, when this pressure wave hits your eardrum, which jostles those bones, which pumps those little bones, which pumps that window and sends fluid around your cochlea, from that, you can tell whether I'm speaking loudly, softly, whether I'm angry, whether I'm happy. It's just remarkable how much discernment comes from that. Now, in order to get that discernment, of course, all this has to be integrated with your brain. If you had a brain but didn't have a perfectly formed ear, you would not be able to process the sounds that were thrown at you. So God's creation is not just about creating irreducibly complex things like the ear, but it's integrating those with other irreducibly complex things like your brain through another irreducibly complex thing called your nervous system, and all fed by another irreducibly complex thing, your circulatory system, because without blood, it would all die anyway. So when people say it could just happen by a big bang, or as a result, it could evolve, there's no way that could evolve. It's far too complex. And if you take away any part, take away the cochlea, in fact, as we'll see in a moment, if you take away something inside the cochlea, you can't hear. So for it to function, everything has to be there, including the nerves to the brain, the blood vessels, and all of those parts. And what, of course, we do using our intelligence is when somebody can't hear, we do things like put a cochlear implant on the side of their head to perform that function, which we had to create with our intelligence. And yet we think that this, which is far superior to a cochlear implant, just happened by accident. It is mad, isn't it? Isn't it mad? But let's look a bit further at the ear. This is the cochlea, and the cochlea has inside it some things called stereocilia. These are little tiny hair-like structures that sit inside your ear, and when the pressure wave that I create with my voice hits your eardrum and jostles the bones that pumps the thing that makes the fluid go round, the fluid goes over these little tiny cilia. Very, very clever. Cilia look like that, although those are not in the cochlea. Those are in the semicircular canals, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in the cochlea, we have the ones on the left are perfectly formed. So they are V-shaped, and they are all attached to nerves, and the fluid inside your ear flows backwards and forwards over them and transmits the sound to your brain. Phenomenal, isn't it? Now, what you've got on the right is damaged stereocilia. The 3 rows up, you'll see there are gaps. Mm-hmm. Those gaps are where those stereocilia have been overloaded with sound, so somebody has blasted them repeatedly, probably somebody who does shooting for a living and hasn't worn ear defenders, or perhaps somebody who goes to nightclubs a lot, but they've been overloaded with sound, and so that particular pitch of sound they can't hear anymore. And you'll find that when people go deaf, they go selectively deaf. Sharon's father was pretty deaf, but he stood more chance of hearing if I spoke to him than if Sharon spoke to him, because my voice is that little bit deeper than Sharon's. So you lose ranges if you damage these hair-like structures. And of course, I used to teach people in industry about this so that they didn't willfully go out and damage their own ears. So that just shows that the irreducible complexity doesn't only stop at the first bit that we looked at, but if you look deeper, it gets more complex, because every single one of those hair-like structures is connected to your brain and transmits sound to your brain, and some of them will transmit a high pitch and some will transmit a low pitch. And when you're exposed to a variation of sounds, it'll pick them all out.
Any idea about tinnitus?
Yeah, tinnitus, not always, but tinnitus often is where you get those broken. If you think about it, they are designed to hear certain pitches. What happens with tinnitus is you hear the pitch even though there's no sound. So you're hearing sounds that aren't being made. And that's because those things that, when they're triggered, tell you that there's a sound in a certain pitch, they're permanently triggered because you've busted it. It's one of the causes of tinnitus, the major cause, because most people who have industrial or work-related hearing loss, they get tinnitus because of the work-related hearing loss that they got through being exposed repeatedly to things like jackhammers or people hammering metal or whatever. So it's broken or disabled cilia that make you think you're hearing a sound when there's no sound being made. It just goes on inside your own head. Usually a whooshing sound, a whistling sound, sometimes bells. Some people have reported hearing bells, like somebody's tinkling a bell non-stop all the time. And people do go insane from it. People have been known to commit suicide because of how inescapable tinnitus is. quite a lot of people will play radio on low to distract them from their tinnitus in order to get to sleep. Sorry, what were you going to say?
When I was working in the surgery, the doctors were referring a lot of young people with hearing problems because of going to places where there was loud music or forever having things in their ears, that they'd be, the loudness of what they were putting in their ears.
I mean, I've still got, at least I think I've got it on my new phone. I used to have a noise meter because I'd go into workplaces and I think the noise in here is horrific and people are going to go deaf if they carry on working in this environment. And I put the noise meter on and I show them, this is where it becomes dangerous for your hearing and this is where we are. So that's a bit more about the inner ear. But then if we go, so this is a comparison with the top slide is good stereocilia and the bottom slide is someone who's very badly hearing impaired. But if we go back to there, you notice on the cochlea, you've got those semicircular canals. Now, I don't know why God chose to attach those to your hearing. I think, actually, there would be logic to it, wouldn't there? Because God did it. But we've said that purple snail shell is full of fluid and it's going around and it's moving these little tiny hair-like structures, these cilia, to give you a sound reproduction. The semicircular canals are also full of fluid, the same fluid that's in the cochlea. And they're also full of that kind of hair-like structure. And what that does is it alerts you to when your balance is off. Nothing to do with noise, but combined in the same organ. You can imagine how did you balance while this was evolving? Has anybody ever had vertigo? I had one dose of it. I never want it again. I couldn't stand up. I didn't know whether I was upside down, right way up. I had to crawl to the loo. It was dreadful. The whole room was moving all the time. It's what happens when your balance system goes kaput. And fortunately, mine was only for a few hours. But some people suffer from labyrinthitis. Well, the labyrinth are the semicircular canals. So labyrinthitis is inflammation of those canals. And that's when you find that I'm dizzy, I'm drunk. Sharon had it for a while and she wouldn't walk between me and the river because she thought she might fall in. So as if that's not complex enough, God has integrated into the same organ the things that stop you from falling over. So about halfway down, the semicircular canals are also concerned with balance. Balance is maintained by fluid flowing around more cilia. So without these, we wouldn't be able to balance. If this organ had evolved, you would have had to have stayed alive through a period of time where you had no hearing and were unable to balance. And even when the organ manages to evolve, how did it evolve the connections with the brain? And there is a further development that makes it even more mind-blowing to me, and that is when you hear a sound, what your body then does, what your brain does, is it makes a file of that sound that if it's an important sound to you, you will never forget. So you'll find that a mother can always recognize her child's cry. Or if you are alerted to a particular danger, whenever you hear that danger, you'll recognize it. It's a survival tool. This idea of making sound files also works in reverse. When I was a truck driver, I used to sleep in my cab, and behind my head was a refrigeration motor running all night. And once I got used to it, I could sleep through it. My brain registered the sound and then blotted it out. And so it didn't bother me. And the only time I would wake up is when the thermostat cut in and the engine stopped on the fridge. And I'd wake up. What's wrong? Oh, the fridge has stopped. And I go back to sleep and then the fridge would kick in and I'd wake up and then I'd doze off again because I'm used to the noise. But how truck drivers are supposed to drive with that little amount of sleep uninterrupted, we did it, but hey. But the point is, God has designed it with forethought. God knew that there would be some sounds it was okay for us to ignore. and some sounds that we would need to be alerted by, and enabled our brains to process that from the ear. You know, it really, I despise this. It really, really sticks two fingers up to God. This, to say, oh, it just happened by accident is so crass. There are many, many machines that we create, cochlear implants being one of them, that took years for us to develop and loads of intelligence, and the finished product is nowhere near as good as what God produced. Who's the engineer chap? Burgess. Stuart Burgess. You listen to him, he makes prosthetic limbs, or used to. I don't know if he still does. He said his biggest frustration is, however clever he was, he could never make a prosthetic hand that was anywhere near as good as the one that God made. And human intellect is not clever enough to make this stuff, but we're supposed to believe that it happened by accident. It's like believing that you throw your hand grenade into your kid's bedroom and it tidies itself. The last example I've got is the bombardier beetle, and it's one of my favourites because it just has everything in it that you couldn't possibly evolve. And by the way, you could pick any animal, really. It's just that some have a bit of a fascinating aspect to it. So the bombardier beetle looks like that.
Mini fire-breathing dragon.
Yeah, except he breathes through the wrong end. But the bombardier beetle, what he does, he has contained within his rear end, he has these two chambers, and his body creates. This is amazing in itself. So somehow that insect's body creates hydrogen peroxide in one of them and hydroquinone in the other one. And if you were to create those the wrong way round, you'd blow the bug to bits. Right? If these chemicals get mixed at the wrong time, the insect is a goner. And now it uses this for defense and sometimes for attack. It normally uses it for defense. But when the bug decides it needs to do so, it mixes the two chemicals in that green structure there. There is a sphincter muscle that controls the release of it. And at will, the bug can mix those chemicals and release a gas at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the same temperature as the boiling point of water. But if it mixed too soon, it would blow the bug to pieces. If it didn't mix at all, then the bug would get eaten. So how did it survive while it was developing a little mini chemical factory in its back end? It is irreducibly complex, isn't it? And the strange thing is, evolutionists, they will always revert that their defense mechanism when you say, tell me how that could possibly have evolved. Oh, well, if you have enough time. And that's when you jump to the other stuff we've been doing. In fact, I've not done it in detail, but I will at some point, which is, even according to their calculations, there hasn't been enough time. That if you take the laws of probabilities, you work out that 14 billion years is minuscule compared to the amount of time you'd need to have any chance of even one of these things happening by random chance. And you don't need one of them to happen. You need hundreds of them to happen at the same time. And that's the thing about irreducible complexity. This bug can't develop the ability to produce hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone without also developing the ability to keep them separate and only join them when it's advantageous to do so. How did it live while it was spending millions of years developing these talents? The answer is, it's a fairy story. The hermit crab was the other one I was going to look at. And I saw hermit crabs on a beach, and I thought, that is a beautiful example of irreducible complexity. So the hermit crab is a crab that steals other animals' shells. So it'll scuttle along the bottom, it'll find a snail shell of the right size, and it will inhabit it. One that's not inhabited, it won't kick the previous owner out of its home. It'll find an empty shell of the right size, and it will creep inside and it will make it its home. And when the home gets too snug, it'll move out and find another one that's a bit bigger. And it developed this body that fits snail shells. So that's one without its shell. And it's ideally suited to fit inside that type of shell. So where did it live while it was evolving that? And what made it pick snail shells? Why not pick clam shells? Or this symbiotic relationship, which is symbiotic simply means that, I guess, working together. How did it ever learn to work together with snails? Because both the snails and the crab had to be there at the same time for that to happen. You know, if the snail had evolved too quick or too slow, then the hermit crab would never have had a home. Or perhaps it would have developed a different size body over a different number of millions of years to suit something else. But you see what I mean? There's a symbiotic relationship designed by God to reveal to us the marvels of our Creator. And one of the marvels is that he creates things to live symbiotically. Astonishing. It's fascinating to watch them as well, all crawling around with somebody else's house on their back.
Little swapsies as well.
Yeah.
Like one will move out and the other one's ready to move in.
It's a bit like student accommodation, really. So that's my offering for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it.
I had a question myself.
Yes, do.
It's not for us to answer, it's for the evolutionists to answer. Which came first, the male or the female of everything?
Well, this is a whole other debate, isn't it? The debate starts before that, and that is lots of animals are either they're asexual or hermaphrodite. And in both cases, they don't need to sexually link up with another animal in order to reproduce. So the earthworm, for example, is hermaphrodite. And so two earthworms do need to meet in order to, you notice on an earthworm, there's a thick band, the saddle, and they match up the saddles in order to mate. So they do still need other animals to mate. But there are animals who are completely asexual. They don't need another animal. They just have both sexes contained within the same animal. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, that would be perfect. Absolutely, because you never need to find a mate. You can't possibly go extinct if you never need to find a mate, theoretically. So why would evolution, if it's for the survival of the fittest, ever bother to produce heterosexual reproduction? It wouldn't.
And they're basically saying something that can reproduce itself. So suddenly decided one day to pop out a female or something.
Because it's identified as a female instead of a male.
Yeah, we're going back to this now, aren't we? But no, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, heterosexual reproduction is a potential failure. Because if you don't find a mate, you go extinct. If you don't need to find a mate, you've got better chance of survival. So it's anti-evolutionary.
But even so, if they think that, say, a cow, was the cow originally a female or was the cow originally a male? And
if the cow was both, what's the point in then it becoming a male and female?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Plus, from a human point of view, it was the male that was first. And woman was taken out of man. Now, whether God did the same with the other animals is not revealed to us. Whenever I study this, I'm left with this impression of how important it is that the people who children look up to are telling them the truth. Because, I mean, as a school kid, I've said this before, I remember my biology teacher, when I said to him, how do you know this? Because he was talking about evolution. And I said, well, how do you know things evolved like that? And he said, well, the other option is creation. I just think that this is more likely. And that was his. But I looked up to him because he's a science teacher and he knows a lot about a lot of things. And I'm jealous of his knowledge.
That's the thing, isn't it? They tell you, yeah, this is it. And then this is it. This is what happened. And you just, wow. Yeah.
Science proves everything.
Yeah.
It's I find it awe-inspiring when we read the scriptures, and then we get in Romans 1, in Romans 1, it says we have no excuse because of the creation. And that's even after all these thousands of years where, I mean, what am I trying to say? Romans 1 was written, I think, in about 70-ish AD. And they didn't have the knowledge that we have. And even then, God said through the Apostle Paul, you're left without excuse. You've only got to look at the creation to know that there's a God. We have developed so much more knowledge, and that statement is more true today for us, and yet we're more determined to say God didn't create it. And we've got more evidence of creation now than they had.
It's man trying to be God, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Which is why Darwin's theory doesn't matter anymore, because that's what they had. Because now they don't need his theory. Because man can create his own evolution. He can create what becomes evolved. So it might not have died completely, but Darwin's theory will die out because of that.
I mean, I think in the schools, Darwin's theory is very much alive and kicking. It's in the science labs and the higher end of the science labs where PhDs are now beginning to say this doesn't add up. So we need to find an evolutionary solution that does add up, but they can't because there isn't one.
There was an article on the radio today about, I think it's Erasmus, who invented the textbook.
Oh, yeah.
And he had 3 principles, and I can't remember what the third one was because I was driving and I had to concentrate on something else. But the first one was truth, and the second one was justice. And the third one I can't remember. But I thought, he said, you've got to tell the truth, and then you've got to have it make sense. And I'm thinking, well, how does that work with evolution then? They're not telling the truth and it doesn't make sense.
I think it's like anything. If they get you young enough, you're like, wow.
Yeah.
There's when Tony first came to the Lord and he'd done a geology degree, and we had some fairly heated debates because he wasn't open to creation at all. And it was clear that he had developed some sort of relationship with his own education, which he was proud of. He'd got these degrees. If I took away that, I was taking away the very foundations of everything he'd built since school. And he's now a man in his mid-30s at this time, I think, and he's got to face the idea that everything he's been told is nonsense. And all those people who he revered weren't worth the reverence that was offered to them.
Well, and they have to lie to pass their exams.
Yeah.
And they make it about your identity, don't they? You know all this stuff. This is who you are. And you've taken away that identity sort of thing. Because I know this stuff.
I think it's a good job I left the civil service when I did. Because I think I'd have been slung out fairly soon afterwards, just because I held really radical views like homosexuality is actually sinful and God created the earth in 6 days about 6,000 years ago, and it was just beginning. I was just beginning to find that I was meeting position. I tried to get a prayer group started, and in the civil service, you're not allowed to offend people. You see. Some young woman got offended at the fact that I was... Yeah, but you're not allowed to offend them. Now, if you work there, you're not allowed to offend your colleagues, even if they're talking utter nonsense. And this young woman decided that she didn't want me sending out a general email invitation to a prayer meeting. She didn't want to receive it. And so I said, okay, well, I'll just take you off the list. And that wasn't good enough. She didn't want other people who didn't want to get it either. Yeah.
Would they have listened to you if you said that she was offending you?
Oh, of course not. Of course not. But interestingly, she subsequently got saved. Because because all this came about, this offence came about because we were stuck on a train together going to some sort of event, and I gave her the gospel on the train. And that brought about the offence that made the prayer meeting stop, but eventually she came to Christ. So
he works in mysterious ways.
He does.
God has a sense of humour, doesn't he?
It's just amazing.
Anyway, I better turn the recording off.